I've been dragged into the modern world.
Yeah.
I do as much as I have to.
Yeah, but do you still do for your illustration work, you don't, don't you send like the separations and things like that?
Just to Tracy, I have a production artist who assembles files for me. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, because I've been working with Tracy who's at Drawing Quarterly, and I just pay her to assemble things for me now. When I do, to be honest, I don't even do that much illustration anymore.
Really?
Well, there really isn't much of an illustration world anymore. If somebody calls me, I'll do it.
Yeah.
But like the days when I used to get called to do like real illustration, for articles and stuff, that's long over. Occasionally the New Yorker calls or something. But that whole world of, commercial illustration, it's dead.
Hmm.
And on top of it, I'm old. So it's like they're not calling me for that stuff anymore. They've got young 20-year-olds who are doing that stuff.
Have you ever been tempted to adjust your style to appeal to the youth markets to try and
I
like
don't really know what it, yeah, I don't even know what it looks like anymore, like in a way. I mean, I kind of know. I can see there's a kind of a cartoon style now that's very geometric with
yeah.
the proportions. The bodies are big and the heads are small. It
Mm.
kind of comes out of a world of like kind of out of Michael DeForge and like Eleanor Davis and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like it's a little more computery. I see it all the time now. I like it. It's actually a pleasing style, um, and it's very cute. Everything's super cute now. But I couldn't. I'd have to work really hard to come up with something that fit in that world. It's too late.
I think I think it was those three. I think Lily Correa, I think Eleanor
Yeah,
Davis, Michael
yeah,
DeFord. It's like an amalgamation of like all of their styles that
yeah.
the generic kind of corporate illustration style.
Exactly.
Google and everything, they all use it.
It's kind of like back in the early 70s when Peter Max and Crumb, they just sort of took their work and then corporatized it. And
Mhm.
you look at all the just all the commercial art from the period of about 71 to 75, and you just see like there's a bland version.
Mhm.
And that's sort of what's going on right now. There's a kind of a bland underground comic style that's become the standard corporate style, like you said.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder about that because I remember when Michael DeForge hit the scene, like when Lose first came out.
Hmm.
But he like shat their pants. They could not like his style was so unique and so
Yeah,
I saw all these cartoonists I knew started adjusting their styles to look more like his.
yeah,
And I think what happened with that was that it wound up watering down his own work, not because of him, but because everybody was copying him. That
absolutely.
he
That
did.
always happens. It's funny. He became the standard art comic style. Like when you walk through a zine fair or something, it's like there's an enormous amount of work that's kind of based on that's kind of the standard look if you want to do comics that are supposed to be art.
Mm-hmm.
That are kind of like I'm not trying to do, stuff like those old guys or whatever. It's like it paints it as you've got the Rizzo cover and you've got that very stylized DeForge style. But the funny thing is DeForge's own style has moved on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like he's fighting against that style in every book now, deliberately making choices that are, I would almost say, like non-aesthetic choices, deliberately trying to make the artwork ugly or busy or perplexing. I got to give him credit for that. I feel like Michael never rests on his laurels.
Yeah, that's true.
It's funny how it happens. I mean, for me, actually, the funny thing is there's like two doorways for comics that were super important, and I don't think anyone would ever list them as like apparent in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Jack Kirby, which would be why I'm even drawing comics, and the
Wow.
second would be the Hernandez brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of those like have left any stylistic footprint.
Yeah.
But what did leave the stylistic footprint was the New Yorker cartoonists I started copying.
Mm-hmm.
That had a tremendous lasting aesthetic appeal.
Yeah, I would say people would compare you to like Peter Arno or Charles Adams, somebody
Yeah.
like that.
Although when you look at the work, it's really a pretty tenuous connection in
Yeah,
that
that's true.
the work doesn't look much like it anymore. But
No,
it's the,
no, but it's the doorway thing. You can tell that
yeah,
that's
exactly.
but also that's not the doorway you came in through because I actually found those issues of Mr. X that you did,
Yeah.
and it's like it's not Seth, like it's not it's not you.
Yeah. Well, that's where I was really like, I was really like learning right then. And the key things I was looking at around that point was Jaime and Yves Chaland and Hergé.
Mhm.
Those were the big, I was really studying. That's why I think I've ended up with this clear line style essentially. Because as much as Jaime does use textures, he's got a very bold, clear line. And
Mhm.
certainly those other artists do.
And you were following his work on Mr. X, right? When you were hired
Oh
there?
yeah, there was like I think an artist in between us. There was forgotten his name now, Klaus Schoenfeld or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean, I was trying to follow Jaime's work, but it was impossible. I mean, I was just starting out and I did not have any real drawing chops. And Jaime, he can draw like you could always draw like nobody.
Hmm.
So it's like I wasn't trying to. I knew I wasn't going to be able to compete with Jaime, but I was certainly looking at his drawings to figure out how to draw those characters.
Was there a pressure from the publisher to have that look, maintain that Hernandez look?
No, Bill was not really like Bill Marks, who was the publisher. He was not what do I call that? He was not very hands-on. He was a very easygoing guy. It's like, why would he have hired me anyway? He hired me because I was nearby. I was a guy he met, somebody who wanted to do comics and was available. I mean, this was his premiere book. He just had Jaime Hernandez on it. You'd think he'd go out and find someone who'd be like, could do something with the book, but instead he just hired a guy who's right out of art school who'd never drawn a comic book in his life. So I think it was just like, I need somebody, and you happen to be here. So even though for years after that I regretted working on the book, now I'm grateful. Now I think like that was a really good apprenticeship for me.
Yeah, I think it would be, but you left out a part, which is that you did not even graduate from art school. You dropped
No,
out.
I did not. I
Was
left art school in third year.
was that after you did you come to the realization like I want to be a cartoonist and this is not going to help me get to where I want to get to?
No, it was just a fuck up, like a youthful fuck up. I was in third year. In between second and third year, I like discovered the nightclubs and drugs. And so when I got back to art school in September, I just was not motivated. I was too busy like living my life. I was too busy having fun. And I would do my assignments like, in the morning before I'd go to class. And eventually I stopped doing the assignments. And then eventually I stopped attending. And then at some point I was just, I was out. I was out of art school. And then I had like kind of a crisis. It's funny. Now I think back on it and I think like this crisis must have been like a month long, but it felt like it was a big life turning event because up until that point, I had always just said, I'm going to be a cartoonist. It was like my life plan. And I wasn't doing any drawing or anything. I wasn't interested. This is before I discovered the Hernandez brothers' work. I was like, I had stopped reading comics because the last comics I'd read before this would have been like maybe some Frank Miller Daredevils or something. I was done.
Mhm.
I'd lost interest in all those superheroes. And then one day I sort of just said to myself, like, this was a pipe dream. It's like I'm not even interested in comics anymore, and I don't draw anymore. So what am I going to do with my life? And I was, I was probably like 21 years old. I was very perplexed, and I think I at that point I decided I should go back to art school. So maybe this was a few months after I kind of dropped out, and around this time, so I started putting together some kind of a portfolio again because I figured I'd have to go back and reapply. And around this time, I went into the Silver Snail comic book shop, which was the first time I'd ever been in there, I think. I'm trying to think of exactly how this happened, but I know that the cartoonist Ken Stacy, I met him, and he said to me, I showed him some shitty comics I'd drawn. And he said to me, you need to buy this comic right now. And he took me over to Love and Rockets #3. And I bought that comic. And then everything changed for me. That's when I was like, now I know what I want to do. This is what I want to do. I want to do these kind of comics.
Was
And
that
then changed everything.
Love and Rockets 3, were they still doing the rockets and dinosaurs kind of stuff in that? Or?
Yeah, it's the third issue. Is the cover, a great cover by Gilbert with like a superhero woman holding a baby, and I think maybe there's light beams coming out of her eyes or something. And I think it was Jaime had finished the mechanics story that was in 1 and 2. I didn't see that for years.
Yeah.
So he'd started some new stuff with Maggie and Hopi and Izzy that was just like all punky stuff. They were just wandering around the neighborhood, and there was a couple of short strips and the first installment of Heartbreak Soup. So these were great. This was a great issue, and it's like the minute I read it, I was like back at that comic shop like the next day, and I was like, "Where's number 4?" And they're like, "Number 4 won't be out for months." I must have went back every week asking for number 4, and because I was still used to like Marvel Comics, the comic book came out every month. And actually, to be fair, they were putting that comic book out quite frequently back then. I think it came out a few times a year.
Yeah.
But that issue just blew me away. It kind of showed, and right around like very soon after that, I realized there were no other comics like that. Because I went in and I said to the owner of the Silver Snail, or the manager, I said, I want some more comics like Love and Rockets. And he said, well, buy these. And he put like 10 issues of American Flag into my hand.
There you go.
Bought them. I never forgave him for that because that was I hated that comic like instantly. But what I did discover quickly after was I started buying old underground comics, which I did not really know. I'd seen Crumb, I'd read Crumb, but in the pop culture way that stuff just filters into your life. It was just stuff floating around. I just thought of them as dirty hippie comics. I'd never given any consideration to that as a comic book. But then I started reading Crumb right around that same time, and those two poles were enormously important.
Do you remember what Crumb it was that you first saw?
Yeah, it was Plunge into the Depths of Despair
Oh,
comics. Yeah, that
yeah.
was a great intro. And then quickly I found almost all those 60s and 70s comics by Crumb. And I found right around that time, actually maybe even before I bought the Crumb, I bought Binky Brown, which
Okay.
was like blew my mind. And it blew my mind in a way that's different than how it would now. I read it and I knew nothing of who Justin Green was or anything about the comic at all. And at the end, I thought, this is the work from a lunatic. I was like, this person is insane. I was talking about that comic for a month to like my friends at the nightclubs and stuff, like that this must be some sort of insane person's comic. I didn't realize at all the impact that comic had had culturally, but I know that it immediately hit me with great power. I didn't recognize for a while that there were other comics by Justin Green and that he was an actual, working artist and not just like a crazy old hippie of some kind.
Yeah. Well, I guess Raw would have been out around that same time too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I discovered that not long after that. It's funny. It's like, it's all in retrospect. I feel like this happened over a span of a year, but I bet you it happened in about 2 months.
Yeah.
Suddenly everything, the world opened up. Within a short time, I was reading the Comics Journal. And suddenly, I was discovering a whole world of comics I didn't know anything about and developing a mindset. Like I remember when I bought the first Comics Journal, it changed my opinion of comics too, because I went from this super optimistic feeling of like, wow, there's this great time we're living in with these great comics. And then I read the Comics Journal. I was like, oh man, comics are shit. It was like so negative. Gary Groth was so negative about the state of comics. I was like, it totally the complete bummer. But that was a good, important bummer for me. It's like it set me back on my heels. Like this isn't going to be, some golden age.
Oh yeah. Well, he was right. I mean,
Hmm.
Klaus told me that back then you would just go to a comic shop and you'd buy anything that wasn't a superhero, and it was just like
Oh
the
yeah,
terrible stuff, but you just buy it because you wanted to buy
yeah,
something. You wanted comics, but
yeah. And
so,
that's kind of how you developed a set of criteria of what was any good anyway. You'd buy any anthology, any black and white book that came out from any marginal publisher that, stuff that you'd never for a second buy like 10 or 15 years later. You'd be like, wouldn't even look at it. But it was just that it was a non superhero book. Um, I mean, there was lots of that middle ground stuff like Eclipse and things like that. But almost instantly, I knew not to waste my time on that.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny you bring that up because right now, as a matter of fact, I'm rereading this one, which is Walt Kelly's Christmas.
Oh yeah. Well, I must, yeah, being unfair to them. They did publish like oddball stuff, like, old romance comics and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. And but I'll see this and I'll be like, oh, Eclipse put this out. That's so weird. And then there's
Yeah.
like ads for like what was coming out around the same time, and it's like, oh look, you can pick up Fusion, like whatever.
Yeah. It's funny, even Fantagraphics wasn't that great at that point too. They were still putting out oddball science fiction things, and like Gary was developing a criteria, like an aesthetic sense at the same time.
Hmm.
I mean, the thing about Love and Rockets #3 too that always strikes me as funny is that, and maybe a #4 as well, is that Gary in the beginning of the comic, he has a page where he tells you what to appreciate in the comic. He literally like describes what the comic's about and how because you're not smart enough to get it. And I think that kind of describes what Gary felt about the comics industry. It's like he couldn't trust people to understand why this was good.
Yeah, well, he was right about everything. I mean, the
Yeah,
comic was right.
he was.
They really hated him for all that stuff, but there's a reason why their book is called "We Told You So." It's
Yeah, they
like they,
still hate him. He's a hated figure in comics, like from the old guys. The
yeah,
old guys have so much resentment that he had the nerve to tell them comics are for idiots and that it's bad work.
yeah. And now it's funny because now he's kind of lost that tooth. He's
Yeah,
he's a lot more mellowed out now and stuff. So younger cartoonists are like, "Oh, Gary's great" or whatever, and they have no idea. Like
no,
guys, like they like hunch their shoulders up at the hearing his name or whatever. It's like,
I
what?
know. Yeah, it's funny when I first met Gary, I was super intimidated because he had like such demanding taste. I thought like I'm meeting him and he's going to be judging me, and two, he was just so smart. It was very obvious he was so well read, so smart. I thought like he's just gonna I'm an idiot that he will, look down his nose at. But the nice thing about Gary is he was always nice. He's a nice person. And the same was true with Art Spiegelman. I was afraid of meeting Art Spiegelman, but couldn't have been more supportive, more encouraging.
If you love comics like he does, he's your best friend.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
talked to him forever about that stuff. Um, so did you learn like all your lettering skills and those kinds of things in art school? Like, was there actually a benefit?
Well, it's like all cartoonists. You learn yourself, you teach yourself. I mean, art school was a waste of time. I went, it wouldn't have been a waste of time if I'd been a different person and if I'd known what to take. It's like I made the mistake of going to art school and think I want to be a cartoonist. What will help me be a cartoonist? And I went into the commercial design department, and that was of no use whatsoever. I mean, that was there to teach me to work as a magazine illustrator, or maybe and I was too young. I didn't even know I didn't even understand art. What I should have been doing is gone into the fine arts department or maybe into the experimental arts department and just like made crazy art. That's what would have been better for me to learn something about art. Instead, I went into a section that was, might as well have been filled with engineers. Nobody was interested in art in this section. They were just interested in getting a job or learning skills so you could maybe be a children's book illustrator or, something where you could make a living.
Yeah.
I didn't start like learning anything really till I mean, like I learned as a teenager to draw comics by drawing comics. And then when I was in my 20s, I learned by studying the cartoonists that I was interested in then. It's the story of every cartoonist.
When you left art school and then you had this like punk phase, that's when you
Mhm.
changed your name to Seth, right?
Yeah.
So when that was over and you were like, I'm gonna reinvent myself as a cartoonist, why didn't you change your name back to Gregory Gallant?
Because I was still young and stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, I was still cool. I was trying very hard to be cool. I mean, when I started on Mr. X, they kind of promoted me as this mysterious one named artist. And, I was going with it. Um, I was still like, in my early 20s. And I was, at the height of my interest in being like a cool guy. I had like, shoulder length white hair and all kinds of piercings and I sometimes think to myself like what if I'd stayed that guy. I meet guys my own age that are like still that guy and it's pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And then was there like a moment though that happened where you kind of discovered the aesthetic that you're going to dedicate your life to, or was it a gradual thing?
It was a kind of a gradual thing. I mean, when you look back, it's funny. I make fun of that period of my life, but it was a super important period for me. Going to those nightclubs and hanging around with all my essentially new wave friends, because we weren't really punks, in the sense that I always hated punk music, to be honest. I was like, I was listening to like electrobeat music from England, really. I've always hated like hard, loud music. So it was like, it was very poppy. And the people around me, it was a very gay subculture. Everybody was like just having a good time. Nobody was worried about, No Future and Johnny Rotten. It was very superficial. But what was great about it was a really kind of do what you like culture. Be whoever you want to be outrageous. It really had a strong emphasis on, freaking out the squares. And that was really important for me because it kind of opened me up to like to live my own life and to not be concerned too much with what others think. Now, that's always bullshit in that, of course, you're always trying to impress people. But on some level, it led me down the path where I am now today, still following my own particular thread. But I did, my interest, my movement to becoming like the old fashioned 40s kind of guy was really an extension of that superficial nightclub world. It was the people around me where we were, it was all about style and all about image. And I met a friend who was really into jazz and he wore beautiful 40s suits. And I just thought he was a very cool guy. And this was around the same time I was reading Robert Crumb, and same time I was watching Woody Allen films. And there seemed to be a kind of a united aesthetic there of looking back and appreciating the past. And it sort of opened a door where I stepped out of one superficial thing into another superficial thing. But then it grew deeper. And over the years, from then on, that moved from just like, moving from being like a new wave hipster to a 40s hipster into an actual a personal aesthetic that has like informed everything I have done since then.
Well, that man that you mentioned, did he help you out, like figure out how to, where to go to complete that aesthetic?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was a young fellow. He was my age, but his father was a jazz musician, and he just had. I feel like my whole life has been an experience of meeting people who had a greater depth of knowledge about something, and then they steered me that way or gave me directions. He was a very influential figure for me, even though he was probably the same age I was. But he knew music, and he would turn me on to different, old jazz musicians and blues, and he would make tapes for me. And he didn't take me out, show me where to buy clothes, but certainly it's like it was, fashion is an education as well. You start out just thinking like, oh, I want to get a suit, and then eventually a time comes by that you come to understand the history of how men's suits are designed and et cetera, et cetera. And it's every rabbit hole you go down, there's an infinite amount of information and detail you can get into if you're interested enough, which
Yeah,
is one of the great things about any kind of art form, any kind of collecting. It's the great experience of human culture. It's fascinating.
John Porcelino told me once that in the '80s you could go into a thrift store and there'd be amazing things there, that were like really well crafted and stuff, and you could get nicely tailored, made older clothes and stuff. And then now you go into a thrift store, it's all like yellowing plastic junk that like nobody wants. But in the '80s,
Yeah,
it was still available just for
oh,
cheap.
totally. Yeah, no, I often dream of those thrift shops that I was looking in the wrong stuff often.
Mhm.
There were whole racks of beautiful clothes from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And of course, thrift stores now, I'll still go into a thrift store or to a vintage shop. Vintage now is 90s clothes. It's like it's garbage.
Yeah.
This isn't even an aesthetic comment. Of course, I hate the clothes from the 90s, but they're cheaply made. They're junk. They were meant to be thrown away. The clothes from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, for the most part, were like beautifully tailored. but you can't find that stuff in those stores anymore. That's all gone. I mean, old people now are like old people are people my age. And what
Yeah.
kind of stuff do old people have? They have garbage. You go to a yard sale, I don't want any of that garbage. It's like
Mhm.
it had to be, you had to go back decades to go to a yard sale where actual old people had interesting stuff.
What I'm actually really interested in is this time period between Vortex and Mr. X and then Palookaville, where how long was that? A couple of years maybe or something?
Yeah, a couple of years. I
You weren't
think it was
comics?
like right after I left Mr. X, I knew I wanted to do some real comics, but I had to make some money, I thought. So how will I live? And I knew Maurice Vellicoupe quite well, and he was a very successful illustrator at that point. So I thought, oh, magazine illustration, there's a way to make money. I'll do some magazine illustration, and that will give me money. And in my spare time, I'll work on a comic book. And so that's what I set out to do. I made like an illustration portfolio and I went around to magazines and I got jobs. And I think for that first 2 years, I mostly did illustration work while I slowly worked up a first issue of Palookaville. And so I'd say, yeah, I'd say maybe 2 years. I'm not sure. But right at the end of that, I met Chris Oliveros just as I'd finished that first issue. And I was thinking of shopping it out to Fantagraphics and to Kitchen Sink. But Chris was like he only had one book put out at that point, which was Drawn and Quarterly #1. But here was a guy right in front of me who's like, I'm going to publish it. And so I was like, okay, let's do it.
Were you thinking that Vortex would publish it at all?
No, no. Bill Marks and I were on the outs. We had a very bad ending.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was no. I mean, we had a serious, like, blowout in the office where, I left that office shaking.
Wow.
It was, yeah, a big deal.
Is he still in comics anymore, or is he out?
No, he works in the movie industry somehow.
Oh, okay.
The producer of some sort in Canadian film.
So, did Chris Oliveros have like like I'll start publishing your work in Drawn and Quarterly, and then I'll publish Palookaville #1, like to introduce you in any way, or
A good question because I think I was in the first like a few issues of Drawn and Quarterly.
before Palookaville
And
1?
it might have been. I'm not even sure to tell you the truth. I feel like yeah, probably. But I think things were happening fairly fast then compared to how things were later. I think Chris probably put out an issue or two a year at least, maybe two issues at least, maybe even three. So I would say that I did a couple of things in Drawn and Quarterly, and then Palookaville 1 came out. And I think during that little time, yeah, during that little time, Dirty Plot #1 came out just before me.
What was the reception for Palookaville at that time?
It was good. I mean, in the sense of like good for those times. I got letters. The issue sold as well as, I can't remember any numbers or anything, but it sold, well enough. Um, I think that it's like, just what we were talking about back then. If you put out a book, everyone who was interested in those kind of books bought it.
Hmm.
Whatever the number of comic fans were that were interested in those kind of comics, they bought everything. So you'd really have to like put out a terrible comic to not have the first issue sell.
Do you remember getting letters from like any cartoonists that you admired at that time when you put out that issue?
I remember initially getting letters from some other cartoonists whose names I knew, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they were like, they were like people I admired. I didn't get a letter from Crumb or anything. Gary Panther wrote me at one point, I remember, which was very nice.
Yeah.
And I was corresponding with people of my own generation that like they certainly weren't writing me fan letters though. I mean, like Dan and I were writing, or Peter Bagg and I. Um, but and I would get letters from like cartoonists, like I remember getting Scott McCloud wrote me stuff like that. People who were around at the time, but I wasn't particularly connected to.
Was Chris Ware really? He wasn't really um, doing his thing at that point, right? I think he was just.
He was. I don't know what Chris was doing at this point. He may have been just a touch too young. I'm not sure when he started working in those like newspapers down in Austin or whatever, but that would have been stuff we would never have seen. The first time I saw Chris Ware was Acme Novelty Library #1, or maybe the story in Raw that he did.
Yeah. And then, have you reread that first issue of Palookaville in a while?
Oh, I would never reread that again. No. Yeah.
I read it. I read it this morning, And as a cartoonist now, I can see how I would have done it differently. How and how your storytelling has changed, like drastically since doing
Oh
that.
yeah.
How you would have written that story differently.
Oh, 100%. There's nothing I would do the same in that comic. I wouldn't even tell that story, first of all. The one thing I learned in those first few issues of Palookaville was what kind of stories I did not want to tell.
Hmm.
And what I realized was telling anecdotes from your life as like a story was like not what I was interested in.
Do you remember what you were going for? Because it feels like you were not. I don't want to be like mean, but it feels like you were like going for like people to go, oh, like I'm sorry
Yeah,
that happened to you, kind of a thing. You know? And
probably. You know, I don't really, to be honest, I have no idea what I was going for, except I was trying to do two or three things. One is I was trying to tell a story truthfully, I suppose,
mhm.
and stick to the facts. Two, I was trying to tell the story only through dialogue and doing it like in a naturalistic way where you follow the characters around,
Yeah,
and not have much narration. And three, I think I was trying to, I guess, no, when I said honestly, what I mean is I wanted a kind of frankness to it that I admired in artists like Crumb or whatever, where you're talking about your life and you show yourself naked or whatever.
right.
Have a certain frankness to it. But I was too young to have much life experience to have much to talk about.
Hmm.
I think now when I look back on it, I'm like, you're right. I was probably entirely seeking sympathy from the audience. I would never tell a story like that in that way now because now I'd want to talk about like I would use a lot of narration because I'd want to talk about like what the hell was I doing? Why did I think this was a good idea? And et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it's
or
just
cut it off. I mean,
primitive.
it could have been cut off like after the incident because you have the incident happen and then the rest of the issue is you being comforted by people. Yeah, I relate so much to your life in a way of, you talk about being a part of like a second family, which I understand. I'm the second to last of like a large,
Mhm.
nine people in my family. But by the time I came along, the family was basically over. Like my parents were, it was not going to last, and nobody was minding me or my younger siblings. It was like kind of chaotic. So I think I have the same thing that you do, that you were saying, looking for a sense of belonging and stuff. I do the same thing. Um, so I relate so much to that part of your life story. Is like, you spend a lot of time alone too as a child, and kind of in your,
Absolutely.
I have a lot of notebooks that are just filled with my own science fiction, basically graphic novels that I drew as a kid. You know,
Yeah.
it's weird. Like I was just in my own world, just making up my own little fake.
Same here. That's what these things behind me here are comics I drew as a child and a teenager.
Yeah,
I was like, I poured myself into that stuff for the simple reason that that was like an alternative reality where I could live.
yeah,
I mean, I think that's why I love Henry Darger's work so much because I see in that world he created that basic artistic urge where you need to make things up for self comfort. It's like it's not about making art. It's about like this. I need this to survive. And a Darger, especially with that brutal, lonely life, it's like he had to invent a whole universe to survive in. It's super potent.
yeah. There was that part in that documentary about him that stuck with me, where it was the end of his life. He's dying, and he said, "I never had a good Christmas."
Yeah.
Ooh,
No, he had a grim life. There's nothing to be like. There's nothing in that life of his to romanticize.
no.
I'm fascinated by the work, but that work is like the work of a man on a desert island. It's depressing as hell the life he had.
Uh, I read through all of Nothing Lasts this week, and I, I get it reads like you're almost emptying out your head. Like these are
Yeah,
all your memories, just getting them all out of your head in paper, and not thinking about an overall structure. Although there kind of is one in a way. Like I think it starts off with the houses that you lived in. I think
yeah.
that's like its own section, and that I think there's childhood friends maybe, and then girlfriends.
It's all based on. It's all structured around places. So
Okay.
I have a simple guiding line. Like when I started this, it's literally a sketchbook project,
Mhm.
and I knew I wanted to like write something. I mean, it starts in the most modest way, and that it's like I'm going to do some comic in my sketchbook. I don't feel like writing anything, so let's just pick something I know. Okay, I'll tell my life, and I don't feel like making any notes or working out any complicated plans. So let's just say I will just start at the beginning and go place to place. And so that's still how I'm thinking about it, although there's a lot of digression. So the digression means that it's not about the places, but that'll still be like I'm working on the thing about the Cove Inn. So that's a place, and that will cover that whole experience. And then after that will probably be art school and my first apartment in Toronto. So
Okay.
it's like it's very simply structured, but that'll allow me to like spin out into whatever I'm thinking of in that. And I don't worry at all about um, anything about the structure. So if I'm going along now, I'm already aware of stuff I should have put in earlier and forgot, but I'll just go back to it. At some point in the comic, I'll say, oh, yeah, I should have said blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's
And
what I like about it.
it just keeps it very free form.
Yeah, you have that looseness of you'll be telling a story, and then the next page you're like, actually, I lied about that. That's not how that happened.
Yeah. I want to keep it that way. And as increasingly as I worked on it, I realized it's more about what I don't remember than what I do remember.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's true. Where you mentioned in part of it that as you get older, that stuff fades, you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
and it really does become a skeleton of what actually happened. And if you would have written about it, 10 years earlier or something, it'd be a different, maybe a more forward
Right.
story, and that is a shame. I mean, I've experienced that myself, where I'm like, I have books that I want to write in the future about specific points in my life that were very potent for me, and I know that if I would have started this 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even, it would have been so much easier to conjure up these
Yeah.
skills.
Yeah, I can't trust my memory for anything anymore. It's like if I get an idea for like the book I'm working on, I think I got to write this down right now
Yeah.
because tomorrow, when I'll say, what was that idea? It's gone.
Oh no.
Yeah, it goes fast.
Yeah. Is it all drawn in the same sketchbook, Nothing Lasts, or are these different sketchbooks that you've been
Not
using?
anymore. I think I drew the first two sections in a sketchbook and then I started drawing them on individual pieces of paper just because they were easier to scan.
Oh, okay. And
Point, it ceased being the same kind of sketchbook project. I mean, it's no more complicated to draw it, um, but it is. I'm not kidding myself. It's a sketchbook project anymore. Now it's meant for publication.
at what point does a sketchbook project become this is meant for public? Like, do you reach a point where you go, actually, this is really good. I can't hold this, keep this to myself. I should.
To some degree, like I was working on another thing. I started. I'm doing a big graphic novel now on the side that nobody's seen,
Okay.
and I won't be serializing. Um, and that started as a sketchbook project too. And I did about 30 pages, and then I was like, "This is too good. It's like it's a good idea." And so then I just scrapped that stuff. That I'm not using any of that stuff from the sketchbook. It changed direction,
Oh,
and I just started doing actual comic pages on that. And so that's a perfect example of like right on like I don't know page 30. I was like, this is a waste of my time doing this in the sketchbook. This should be a real book. And so then it moved into the real world.
well, was Nothing Last just in the beginning? Was it just like, well, here's just like another thing to fill up this issue of Palookaville, and then
Yeah,
at some point you're like, actually, this is too good. I need to.
I think so. I think I realized I was on something that mattered to me at some point. I
Yeah.
think maybe the first section. I mean, I'm now thinking about the book collection of that when it's done, and I'm realizing I'm going to have to redraw maybe the first 10 or 15 pages just because they're too crappy. Um, I won't be able to like make them look right because you can't really go back and fix things properly.
Yeah.
But they're too crude, and the storytelling is very perfunctory, and I just want to fix it up a bit. But after about, I'm going to start like I think maybe at about page 15 or something like that. It's okay. It's good enough. And
Okay.
but I'm now much more aware of how I'm doing it.
I I had suspicions about if the first part of it were if you had to cut it up and relay it out to fit
Yeah,
the. I wondered about that because you have the big panel, right, and
yeah.
then the little panels, and I was thinking, was this big panel originally like on top of smaller panels, and then when he had to reformat this to fit Palookaville?
No, it's exactly like that. But that big panel's going. I mean, that big flower at the beginning, I may still use a flower image. I'm not sure. It was completely random.
Okay.
I had a, I just been studying an old catalog of flowers from the 50s, and I just loved this image of a big flower. And I just plopped it down there and then started the story underneath. And those first few pages are incredibly lazy. I mean, it's like I cover my birth and the house that I was first in like about 4 panels or something. It's like it's too perfunctory. I'm going to drag that out a bit because I need a slightly better opening for the book.
Yeah, and you need
That'll
pacing.
be a couple of years from now.
Yeah, that pacing's a little weird too. You
It
have to
is.
fix those issues.
And
But
it's really poorly drawn. I was drawing with like a fat marker deliberately so that I couldn't make the artwork too precious. And then later I switched over to using a thinner marker and a fat marker, and it just looks better. And so I'll have to fix it.